You tell me when you're ready. Amazing. I think we're recording. Are we? What's going on?
Is this live or being recorded for future?
Both.
This is everything.
It's
It's
things.
live. It's live
everything.
streamed. It's on the
All at once.
podcast, y'all. It's gonna be legit. So, are we good on Syncast?
We're recording the podcast currently.
Are we live
Into
on
the-
the? Okay. Hey.
Success.
All right. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the first Kunafa and Shay live episode. We are here in person at the MENA Theater Makers Alliance Convening 2023 at Golden Thread Productions in San Francisco, California. This session, oh my goodness, you're gonna hear a lot of wooting today, which is not normal for our podcast, although Marina and I are woo girls, I think. Yeah, we are, we identify that way. But we try to keep it in during the podcast. But welcome all the wooing from our live audience here. MENATMA is the National Coalition of MENA and SWANA Theater Makers. And this is a joint session of the MENATMA Convening and the Mizna+RAWIfest that also happened this weekend. Mizna is a grassroots organization serving as a platform for contemporary literature, film, art, and cultural production, centering the work of Arab and SWANA artists. And RAWI, or the Radius of Arab American Writers, is a national organization that provides mentoring, community, and support for Arab American writers and those with roots in the Arabic-speaking world and diaspora. Today's session will explore affinity spaces, and these three organizations exemplify intersectional national affinity spaces in theater and the arts. Affinity spaces have really been an undercurrent of discussion across all three seasons of the Kunafa and Shay Theatre Podcast. And in season 3, we especially focus on queer, MENA, and SWANA affinity spaces, their benefits and their complications. In this live session at the MENATMA Convening at Golden Thread Productions, we are going to be sitting down with leaders and artists to discuss the nuances of MENA and SWANA affinity spaces today, and MENATMA, Mizna, and RAWI's roles in facilitating national cultural affinity among artists of intersectional identities. In the room where change is being made, we are having these conversations, and we're very excited to engage with you all in that discussion. This is a very exciting and unique trifecta collaboration, and Marina and I are truly thrilled to be able to host this joint session of these two conferences, both live streamed on HowlRound, and will be available as part of the Kunafa and Shay Theatre Podcast, maybe a little bit, edited for maximum excellency, and with a written transcript as well for folks. Yes. Take it away, Marina.
Amazing. So thank you all for indulging this really fun experiment. Our initial description included what these affinity groups are doing in a post-pandemic theater landscape. And Feras actually brought up this great point of, while we're acknowledging genocide and death that's happening, we've actually just quite normalized the death that has happened from COVID in our world. And the statistics still point very much to the fact that this pandemic is ongoing. And so we just wanted to amend verbally that language of post-pandemic, or use it in quotes, because while we are acting, and like the last panel said, we've sort of acted like things need to go back to normal in the same way, we're actually not able to return to life as it was before. Nor do we really want to, I think, in many instances. I do want to take a moment here to acknowledge the people of the land on which we live and work today, the multiple Ohlone tribes. Despite the atrocities of colonization and genocide, Native communities persist today and are active in efforts to preserve and revive their culture. At Golden Thread, we are driven by a desire to expand this land acknowledgement statement to recognize our community's experience of occupation in the Middle East, the refugee crisis, and the displaced population. Whether we are immigrants displaced by political or economic events, or US born for one or more generations, we all appreciate the human connection to the land. And something we've been acknowledging a lot, which I deeply appreciate because I feel like I've been mourning so much on my own, and so I'm grateful to be in community. We deeply mourn the Palestinian and Israeli lives lost in the recent eruption of violence in Gaza between Israel and Hamas. We grieve the loss of all those who have been killed in search or protection of home, and condemn violence and terrorism in all its forms. We also recognize that any condemnation of violence that has erupted this past weeks without recognizing the root cause of the situation, Israel's illegal military occupation since '67 and also since before the Nakba in '48, is unacceptable. As a US-based alliance of Middle Eastern and North African artists, we support the Palestinian people's right to sovereignty, freedom, and a life with dignity. We condemn Israel's apartheid system and creation of the world's largest open-air prison, Gaza, imprisoning 2.3 million Palestinians, 74% of whom are refugees. We denounce the mainstream media and the U.S. government for granting Israel impunity as it continues to deny the human rights of Palestinians and commit war crimes. Dehumanizing Palestinians and spreading anti-Palestinian sentiment puts all communities in danger. We call for an immediate end to Israel's settler colonialism and violence to Palestine. So as we sit with that together, I think we acknowledge that, and part of our community agreement this weekend has been to sit in grief and rage together. I appreciate being in a space of artists who are willing to do that as we have this important conversation too. So I'll ask the guests to introduce themselves next, and we're going to be oddly passing these black microphones that are recording the podcast around, and we will send it first to Andrea.
Hey everyone, any instructions on introductions?
If you want to do name, pronouns if you want to share them, and then your role as an artist, people that are listening might not know, although people in the present company certainly do.
Yeah, people here are like sick of me already because I've been on several panels. I'm Andrea Assaf. I'm the founding artistic and executive director of Art to Action, which is based in Tampa, Florida. I welcome she or they pronouns. Or anything said in love. In the South, we like to say things like sugar. I just need to say I'm here. I feel like I'm always wearing a lot of hats, but I want to give a shout out to my RAWI and Mizna friends and colleagues who I've been missing terribly this weekend. That these two events, very important and amazing events, are happening at the same time in different parts of the country, which also I think is a significant win, like that we're in multiple places at once having these conversations, right? But I do give a shout out to my beloved literary community, which was, I have to say, the first space where I felt I was welcomed to be Arab and queer at the same time.
Thanks, Andrea. We're going to pass it over to Evren next, if that's okay, and then we'll do Sara.
Hi, everybody. Evren Odcikin, he, him, his. I'm a Turkish American, director, writer, and arts leader. I am on the board of MENA Theater Makers Alliance, very proudly, and an affiliated artist with Golden Thread, which is a company I like to say that I grew up in. I was raised artistically and as a human by Golden Thread and Taranji Gezarian, who's sitting across from me. And I want to say that it feels important to name, I said Turkish American, but I'm also very proudly queer, very proudly immigrant, and I also identify as Muslim, which feels as much as a political action as it is certainly a way that I look at the world, and morality is through that lens, and my upbringing in a very secular but devoted Muslim home in Turkey. And I'm so excited to be here. It's always exciting to not feel like I have to divide myself in parts to be able to talk. And I will say this, that Golden Thread specifically, before intersectionality was a sexy word that everybody used, the whole organization was founded like that. So I have had the great luxury of not having to cut myself in parts in our communities, actually, in a really joyous way. And I only had to start doing that when I work not in our community spaces, is where I actually feel like I have to leave one side of myself at the door because they're asking me to come into the room for one reason and one reason only. So, but any chance I have to be queer and Middle Eastern and Muslim and then talk to these badass femme humans that I'm sitting with, I feel real good about that.
Hello, my name is Sara, Razavi, and she, her. And when I identify as an artist, it's as an actor and director. And I'm always profoundly humbled when I'm invited to events like this because it's been such a long time where I've been able to engage my artistic self. My day job has taken over more and more of my life, and my day job intersects well, as many of our lives do. I'm in finance, in social finance specifically, I do lending for entrepreneurs who've been left out of the mainstream, so women, people of color, and immigrants. And I joke that, like many immigrants, I have that side, and interestingly enough, it's often maths or finance or science. Toranch herself was a scientist before all of this. But that also as immigrants, we just wear so many different hats. But probably the most important hat right now and what constantly brings me to these tables is that I'm a parent of 2 tiny beings with my wife. And for them and for the future, I now live very comfortably in the intersections of all my identities, where previously it was very segmented. So grateful to be here. Thank you.
And we'll pass it to Feras.
Thank you so much for this space and lovely to share space with you all. My name is Feras Hilal. I'm a queer Palestinian writer and organizer. I live on Korea land, but today I'm speaking from the RAWIfest, Mizna+RAWIfest, which is happening in Minnesota, which is on the land of the Hotha and Anishinaabe and Ojibwe peoples. I wish them sovereignty and continuance. And definitely I echo what Marina was saying earlier, that Gaza, I carry Gaza in my heart and my actions and my words for sure. I'm happy to be with you all here, sharing space with you all.
Thank you so much. We started this season talking about queer MENA SWANA artists with Adam El-Saig, who is not in the room right now. But when we talked to Adam, he said, really? A season on queer? Okay. Is this really the framing you want to do? And he asked some really important curatorial questions that we appreciated. I'm acknowledging that now, so we don't necessarily need to dig into that in this episode. It exists, and I hope that you'll look at that framing, because it was a great question that Nabra and I had already been talking about. Because it can be tokenizing and essentializing, but it can also be really affirming and productive to be in a space dedicated to addressing the lived experience of these intersectional identities. I also wanted to mention that this morning I was reflecting on what we were doing today. And the podcast started whenever I called Nabra one day and I started my PhD. And I thought, now I'm going to be in a space with people where I can talk about MENA theater all day long and they're going to care. And we do talk a lot about performance. But the people that want to talk about MENA theater is actually quite limited in that space. And I was like, Nabra, what if we started a podcast where we would just talk about this and anyone who cared could tune in? And that was before I realized anything about MENATMA, really. And I found that there's an affinity space that exists where we can do all of that. So it feels so luxurious this weekend to be in this space, but also recording this episode together. Amazing. Nabra.
Yes. Yeah, she started her PhD and she was like, I'm going to have so much free time. We should start a podcast. She didn't say that. She was, I think, smarter than that. But it's a ridiculous request at that time, I realize. But I'm glad it's still happening and we're in season 3. It's very exciting. So we're diving deeper into affinity spaces, and I'm actually also really honored to have been a performer at Mizna+RAWIfest yesterday morning at 7 a.m. I was performing virtually and then came over to MENATMA at 9 a.m. So what a lovely morning that was yesterday. So we would love to just start with how each of you define an affinity space. In our MENATMA programming committee meetings and conversations about this session, what an affinity space is and how it should function was not trivial for all of us to define. And so we wanted to know how you define that and how they have played your role in your life as an artist, if you haven't already spoken about that. Anyone can take this away. We're gonna edit out all the giant pauses. I think maybe in the final episode.
For me, an affinity space in my life career has been really directly connected to advocacy and strength in numbers. So it's always been actually with an eye towards change making. I don't know if that's just because of the way I'm built, thank you parents, or just how it works within the specific identities that I hold. Queer organizing is messy and beautiful and difficult, and in a lot of ways that definition of making trouble through not necessarily agreement but an aligned goal is something that I feel like within the theater space has been gifted to me from my elders, and I'll like go all the way back to, I don't know, Tennessee Williams and beyond, Oscar Wilde and beyond for this. And in the MENA space, it's really in my own journey as an immigrant, where and an immigrant that is quite white passing, where assimilation was the goal for the first, I don't know, 5 to 7 years of my life in the US, and trying to lose my accent and trying to figure out how to be pass as white American, and feeling like I was just really truly bad at it. It took a space like Golden Thread, which is of course an Affinity theater company, and not even realizing at the time what a luxury that was, to be able to be in a space where I could say, I don't know if I'm this, I don't know if I'm that, I don't know how this works for me. I don't know if I'm Muslim. I have a lot of feelings as a queer man of defining as Muslim, and then being allowed to make plays about that and have conversations about that and say possibly terrible things about that in safe spaces, and being corrected or guided or just allowed to hit all of the walls and figure out where I stand and build my spine. And the thing I will say for Affinity Space is, it is my experience of Affinity Spaces, especially within the Middle Eastern, North African context, is a really American idea. Yesterday we were having lunch, and we were at a table with a Turkish American artist, an Iranian Armenian American artist, an Azeri Armenian artist, and an Armenian artist, and we had to sort of laugh that in this given moment that this lunch wouldn't happen anywhere else, and and we were really having a deep, wonderful conversation about representation and translation and the impossibility of finding words from one language to another. This like really deep, lovely artistic conversation about Chekhov and beyond, and that was the context. Was an Affinity Space that really felt in a certain way American, in a certain way San Franciscan, in a certain way Golden Thread and MENATMA only possible space. And I grew up there as an artist, so it feels so second nature to me. And it's been a real learning working in more mainstream theaters, larger theaters, and meeting so many Middle Eastern North African artists of Middle Eastern North African descent who haven't had that luxury of growing up and having their spines built solid around political and representation issues, and the like true emotional and mental, which is sometimes physical, suffering they have to go through or have had to go through in theater specifically. I feel lucky to have grown up in an Affinity space like this, and an Affinity space that is intersectional, that is allows me to be all the things I am and not have to explain myself all the time. And I, in a way, like wish that on every young artist, because it is nice to be seen, it is nice to be heard, and it is nice to not have to translate yourself all the time.
I was born in the United States and didn't grow up in a location where I had access to an Arab or Middle Eastern community for most of my childhood. And I want to acknowledge that I grew up in what feels like now a very, very different time in terms of queer identity in the United States. I'm a dyke of a certain age. I made a big deal of turning 50 on social media this year, so I'm not afraid to say it. I'm going to say something, and then I'm going to qualify it. I was in my process of coming out, I was very afraid that Arab and Middle Eastern community spaces would not accept me because of my queerness. Now, I need to say, I grew up in a predominantly Christian, rural Pennsylvania environment that was so deeply homophobic in the 80s that I literally thought someone would literally kill me if I came out. So I think we often get stuck in this like narrative that, somehow Arab and Middle Eastern communities are more homophobic than anyone else. I'm saying rural Christian America, right? And so those affinity spaces, queer affinity spaces, were key to feeling safe as a queer person as a young artist. And am I allowed to cuss? Shit has changed. Like, I am amazed by young folks talking about transgender identity, questioning gender, questioning the relationship between sexuality and gender, which wasn't even a conversation we had then at all, or language for. Like, there has been extraordinary progress. And I think now that I look back on it with this question, what was truly transformative for me was that when Arab spaces welcomed me as a queer person, and I didn't need an affinity space because the whole space was welcoming. And I have to name, because I think it's important that we remember our history and we name people, Barbara Nimri Aziz was the first person to ever give me a radio interview, the first person to invite me to RAWI to be on a panel about the intersection of queer and Arab identity. And it's really important that here at Golden Thread in this convening, there has been 50% or more on the regular, daily, and pretty much everything, queer representation. Yes, beautiful and amazing and powerful and just not questioned. And so that makes me go, wouldn't it be nice if we just didn't need affinity spaces anymore and every space was like this?
I was thinking about this, and moving to the Bay Area in the early aughts, I remember being very clear that I had three distinct identities: as an Iranian, as a woman, and then as a lesbian, and that I would play different cards depending on which room I was in. And then I also thought that I never quite felt enough of any one of those. And so I remember with Evren and I share a group of very close friends, and it was in their company one drunken night. I was outside, and I used to call myself Sara. Everybody called me Sara. And I was drunk, and there was some Middle Eastern guy. He was drunk, and his name was Mamad, and he called himself Mo, and I'm like, no, Mo, are you gonna go by Mamad? And my friends overheard it, and they're like, well, what about you? Why are you going by Sara? You can be Sara. And it changed then. I started going by Sara. And it's a very easy way of telling, who knows me, who doesn't, if they call me Sara or Sara. But that in that moment, it felt like, oh, my Iranian self and my American self maybe can live closely together. But it kept having these moments, and I remember I did a show with a wonderful theater company in the Bay, and I took my then girlfriend to it. This is a room full of very queer artists, and I told her, I said, we can't be queer here because they're Middle Eastern. And we went through this whole party, and I remember being so amazed at how wonderful, how drunk, how great they all were. But I was like, we can't be queer around them. So up until a very, very long period, these worlds were completely separate. And now I think the only reason I'm probably here is because I live it so loudly and so comfortably. And that shift happened, though, over time. And I take your point, because even deciding as a queer woman whether I wear mascara or not, because when I moved to the Bay, you had to be very butch or you had to be very femme. And even that identity of like how I present myself as a queer woman has taken time, and now I recognize just this living is radical in and of itself, and it's an example for so many folks that I've only realized it because I suddenly recognized. I hadn't seen it as much. So anyway, when I was thinking about Affinity, I was really thinking, for me, the longest time it had been so separate.
Exactly.
Feras, do you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, I see Affinity perhaps like as community care, like practicing community care in tangible and in material ways. Like how do we show up for each other in each other's lives? How do we move together in the world? Who do we bring into groups with us? I think also, I feel like a lot of organizing is really around education and educating folks about concepts that might be like what Evren was saying. I don't know if I'm butchering your name, but like pushing the envelope kind of forward. And I would like to invite us all, like, I think this is a good example of that because, I was sharing feedback with Marina prior to the call, and I'm so glad that you brought those pieces of feedback and you integrated them so quickly into the program, about the Nakba and affirming that the occupation of Palestine has been since 1948. But I want to invite us all to see queerness. Definitely it is a sexual identity, but beyond the sexual and gender as well, beyond the sexual and beyond gender, to see it as something, sort of a political decision as well. Today I see like nobody in the world is more queer than those in Gaza, the way that they are invisibilized, the way they are demonized, the way they are intentionally silenced, the way there is a genocide against them, the same way that there was a genocide here against queer people in the form of the AIDS HIV pandemic, so to speak. They call it an epidemic, but it affected more than just queer people. It affected Haitians as well. It affected, working class Black folks. So I was having this conversation a little bit with my also fellow colleague on the RAWI board, Zanjo Hadar, an amazing transgender writer and organizer, just about like how do we push those boundaries of queerness beyond, and how do we see, and also with the George Ibrahim, about like how Palestinianness is a form of queerness in a way, just the way it's constantly marginalized, the way it's constantly pushed to the side. And I want us to, not necessarily right now, but kind of like reflect on that question and carry it with us as we make our way back home together.
Feras, you sort of inspired me to. I just want to say that I do think I use the term queer rather than gay to define myself. One, because I don't want to be that specific about who I sleep with as I identify myself for some reason. It feels like none of your business. And also, for me, queer is a political term. And a very specific political term, because I'm so glad you brought up the HIV/AIDS epidemic, talking about failure of our government to take care of people as we look at what they're doing right now. We have a long history of this, and that's just one example among so many. What I find very moving is the AIDS funerals, the funerals of the people who were killed by neglect as well as this virus, were celebrations, drag parties, dance parties, and I feel like I look at our theater, I'll speak about my art form, and I feel like joy has been gentrified, that there's this idea that like there's a cis white woman version of joy that has, and if I actually claim joy as my resistance, which I say all the time, like I am negating the pain and the grief and the rage that we're all feeling. And having grown up over there, I have a sort of lived understanding of people who are under the worst conditions, that they are the funniest, they are the campiest, they are the most satirical in certain places. And for me, I am queering theater actually feels very similar to the political actions of Middle Easterning theater, which is really about living in comedy as political action, as community joy, and claiming that despite the fact that we're all being killed to a certain extent. And this is something that is really difficult for me to let go of, especially as I work in mainstream spaces where the card I have to play is pain to get a job. And I feel like Affinity, they want my trauma, some of which I don't actually have, by the way. I had a lovely upbringing as a queer boy. My family was wonderful.
Don't tell anyone.
You know, but the second, if I'm doing this panel not led by Middle Eastern or conscious folks, the first question is like, how was growing up queer? Ask with that soft white tone of care. That is actually not care. That's an invitation to perform my pain that I do not have. So it is, and this is not to negate all of the really terrible experiences queer folks have had in Turkey. So and as I say this, I feel like I'm sort of not representing something, et cetera, et cetera. I don't have to talk about it on this podcast because everyone here understands. But the thing for me is, as we talk about queerness, as we talk about affinity space, for me, affinity space is also where I get to be unabashedly joyful and celebratory and unapologetic, not just politically, but as friends, as colleagues, as co-conspirators, and that we hold each other accountable to that as we make space for our rage and grief, which is like I am adding that to every community agreement from now on, by the way. It is like the most brilliant addition. I can't remember who proposed it, but my God. So I just want to say that that idea of joy and joy as political action lives in my body, both in my queerness and my Middle Easternness. And I want to claim that for this space. Soapbox.
Yes, Evren, that was so beautiful, and it takes me back to something that Hamid Sino said earlier, which was, like, you don't use me talking about queerness, I'm paraphrasing them wildly, but don't use my queerness to pinkwash, and don't use my queerness for part of your political or colonial or imperial agenda.
Right.
And that's where joy gets in the way of people who try to use these stories for that purpose. And I want to add to what you're saying, my favorite Bell Hooks quote, if you'll indulge. Anytime we can like throw an amazing black feminist into the space, I feel like we should. But queer, not as in being about who you're having sex with, that can be a dimension of it, but queer is being about the self that is at odds with everything around it, and that has to invent and create and find a place to speak and to thrive and to live. So I love that. It's very much what Evren and Feras were just saying, but wanted to throw Hooks and Hamid Sino into the mix.
Yes.
Thank you for that, Nabra.
You've already touched on a lot of what we were going to talk about, so we should just end the podcast here. I'm just kidding. We're not going to. We're here for 20 more minutes. One of the things that I wanted to go a little deeper into, you've each talked about how, and a little bit of the journey of how the affinity spaces have become intersectional for you, or have presented themselves as being open to intersectional identities. And there's, folks often will talk about, the tensions of being MENA or SWANA in queer spaces, and the tensions of being queer in MENA or SWANA spaces, as some of you have touched on. But can you identify what are the aspects of affinity spaces that have made a supportive platform for your intersecting identities? Some of you have had experience with spaces that have been one or the other. You've had to turn on and off certain identities. But in those spaces where you were able to bring your full self, are you able to articulate what are the elements of that kind of affinity space that has allowed for you to bring your full self with all of your intersecting identities? And those listening can learn from that, hopefully, and curate better affinity spaces moving forward.
As to Evren was talking, I was remembering one of the best spaces was the annual Golden Thread party, where we would bring lots of food and dancing. And one of the moments I probably felt the most seen, you and I were on the dance floor. And there was great drumming going on. Just it was all very out of the blue. Suddenly drums showed up. Suddenly someone was singing, and I feel like he probably had more, what do you
Hip action.
hip action that I could muster, and I probably had more shoulder action than he could muster. And between the two of us, we were doing this extremely queer, completely role reversal dance in the living room of one of our founding board members. That, to me, speaks to everything that's been said, the joy of it, the fluidity of it, the queerness of it, and yet the complete Middle Easternness of it. Gives me joy and great memories.
Just so it is said, I did dance her off the dance floor. Not that it was a competition, but I did win.
We have had many rematches. I think I've won some of them, but
I disagree. I would say, really, people matter more than words for me. Actions matter more than words for me. I think we're in a place right now in the American theater where we have to say like all of the right words for some. We feel like the words are the welcoming thing, and I would rather people show up in their imperfect language but with open hearts. And I understand that I sit in a very privileged body to be able to say this. I also want to own that. But for me, what makes an affinity space welcoming is that people look me in the eye and say welcome. And when I correct them, they say, I'm so sorry, and then just try to use the right pronoun or call me queer rather than something else, or apologize for an assumption they made. I am a little over perfection before arrival as a requirement of an affinity space, because I think that's, as activists, as organizers, and I think everyone on here probably identifies with those words at different levels, but we all are, knowing everybody's work to a certain extent. We keep leaving behind people who are actually really important by doing that. And as someone who lives in very liberal spaces and then is supposed to represent not necessarily people in theater who might actually have those words or believe those things, or they are welcoming but they actually don't know that that's the word you use for that thing. I'm always sort of negotiating that for myself as I try to create space and represent this impossibly large umbrella of folks called Middle Eastern, North African, or Muslim. I try to figure out how to make space for people who are coming from different spaces and make sure they feel welcome and they have an understanding of the rules of engagement rather than correcting people's verbiage.
Evren, can we model what you just said?
Yes.
Because I'm sitting here and I appreciate the feminist impulse that you started the panel with to acknowledge and say, I'm so happy to be up here. But I don't identify as femme.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, because I'm really suck at femme. I've tried and I fail miserably. It's like queer failure all over. I can't do it.
I am very sorry to have used that term to define
Oh,
you.
no. But I do, you're correct that I do identify as a cisgender woman, and that is a space of privilege that I inhabit. And so these are the kinds of, we're doing the conversation. We're like, that was the thing we want y'all to do. And we want spaces to do, right?
Yeah.
It's like, have that conversation. But actually, I wanted to, I really want to dig a little deeper into the joy and trauma conversation. Is that okay?
Yeah, of
Can I
course.
go there? Because I'm thinking about everything you said and how that resonates with me about joy and queer space. And also I'm thinking about my own work, which dives deep into trauma often, right? And I was very much, as an activist, I also embrace the word queer because I do think of it as a much larger political framework than only my sexuality, and that is resisting the normativity or the seduction of capitalism, right, and like pushing back on all levels, political analysis. But I was formed as a young queer person coming out and as a young activist in the 90s during the AIDS crisis, where the slogan was, "Don't mourn, organize." And we did that, and we never mourned. And we carried that grief for more than a decade, right? And then that it still hurts us. It still hurts us. And so I think that a lot of my work around trauma is about creating safe spaces to mourn, collectively, publicly, to cry, to be witnessed mourning. And also there might be a queer Elvis impersonator in the middle of the Drone Project, because that's also important to me, right? Like those moments of let's go deep into the mourning and face our trauma and face our complicity as U.S. citizens in what our country is doing, and also be queer and joyous in the same process, right? So that's what I feel sometimes that there's this either or thing happening that I also want to disrupt.
Absolutely, Andrea. I love that you mentioned that because first of all, I want to thank you for mentioning Barbara Nabi-Aziz, for naming her as the RAWI founder. We all are indebted for her. And actually, the Mizna+RAWIfest was exactly a space, just as you mentioned. We had moments of mourning, of collective mourning, and we had moments of collective joy, and we had moments of practicing collective care and support, and moments of creation as well. And as we all know, as artists, that's the place where we create from, or where we write towards too. And I think to touch on what Evren was saying as well, about mining the trauma, we face a similar predicament as Palestinians, what's your displacement story? That's what the media is always interested in, but never in okay, what brought us to this moment? So I really appreciate Marina and Nabra naming, the root causes of the violence that we just encountered, and naming those white supremacy structures that uphold colonialism as a violent structure in of itself, and therefore an act of resistance becomes really an act of love, right? And resistance is existence, even if it manifests in violence. I believe that it's a lesser evil, to use liberal talk. But to answer the question that was asked, I think when it comes to affinity spaces, I think it's all about really removing the barriers to entry, and that's something that again we try really hard to do with RAWI and Mizna. For example, how do we make it more accessible for disabled folks? And that's why we chose to do a hybrid festival and required masks, and asking people to vaccinate before, or at least take their tests, even though knowing that tests are, not as effective with certain strains. It's also making space for plurality, whatever manifestation that takes. We're expanding beyond the Arab-speaking world into, entering SWANA and beyond as well, with joint struggle partners, with our indigenous, Black, Asian, Latinx siblings. Again, challenging and resisting anti-colonial, anti-imperialist structures, removing barriers to entry for working class people in terms of economics as well, because class is a very important dynamic that we should all make space for, and always look below on the food chain, what do unhoused folks need? How do we bring them into the room? And always thinking about who's not in the room and how do we bring them into the room. And that was a lovely practice that I witnessed this past weekend, and it was something that, because it helps us multiply, right? Like, every time we bring somebody that is not in the room, we bring them into the room, then our numbers increase, right? And that is how we build power, that is how we build care. I believe that is the way to the future, a livable future, if I may say. How do we push back against white supremacy? How do we confront our own anti-blackness within certain Arab communities as well? There's so much to unlearn and so much to learn as well. So yeah, I really appreciate this conversation and where it's going. Thank you all.
Thank you so much for bringing up the other intersections that we have to be considering when expanding and transforming and growing our affinity spaces, because a queer and MENA and SWANA friendly space is not necessarily disability friendly. It's not necessarily anti-Black. So I love thank you for bringing in especially those very specific examples as to how Mizna and RAWI are doing that. I know Golden Thread is also doing that. I know MENATMA is also working on that and that's working for all of us. It's work for all of us, and is a constant growth process. And it's interesting to start thinking about, as we become more inclusive, and this is something we've also been exploring in this season, as we become more and more inclusive of intersection, what does an affinity space mean? And I love the ways that each of you all have defined affinity space, because it's a definition that is hard to put on paper. You've kind of defined it through the vibe, or the way in which your joy can be present in that space, the way in which your grief, your rage, your emotion, what's inside of you can be present in a space, which is very different from saying it's a room in which everyone is MENA and SWANA and queer, which is an interesting way to think about that, and to think about how we grow and expand and create more intersectional affinity spaces. I also wanted to touch on something else you brought up, Feras, which is this hybrid model. So today we're in person, we're live streaming, we're sharing this asynchronously on Kunafa and Shay, and living in a more hybrid world, considerations of the merits and drawbacks of in-person versus live versus hybrid gatherings have become very ubiquitous. And while art making has been multimedia since really the beginnings of advancements in technology, virtuality has become an even more present consideration, especially for performing artists. So how do you consider physical space in your community building, in your affinity creation, and in your art making?
We have about 5 minutes left, so we'll do this sort of more rapid fire.
Yes. And I'll also throw in there, considerations of safety and affinity within virtual spaces that can be so much grander, can be international. How do you consider that when it comes to your community building and affinity curation, I guess?
Yeah. I'll jump in and say, I'm just gonna throw a wrench in here, which is gender, because the spaces that I like to create, maybe because I miss them, because so many have disappeared, are women-only spaces, and that is trans-inclusive, right? And I do that a lot in my work, in my art making. I'm like my joy and pleasure is in women ensemble spaces, and there, and again, there was a period of time when there were lots of, and this is so ironic, right? It's ironic because Middle Eastern and Muslim communities get criticized all the time for having gender segregation in certain public, right? And yet women-only spaces are like my favorite places to be. and so when I'm thinking about creating spaces of safety, it's often around gender identification that is inclusive of trans, non-binary, and various sexualities, rather than around sexual identity defined space in my own work, in my own artistic practice. And so I don't know, I kind of wanted to lift up that, like, when we're making our own ensembles, we're in a sense making our own affinity spaces, right? We gather people in a certain way to create together and to create the safety in which we can do our best work, or ask the deepest questions, or share the deepest stories, right? And so I don't know, maybe that's where I'm at, is like making and remaking those spaces. I don't know if that answered the question, but that was just what
I love it. Yes.
I just want to say, we've been using the word affinity space, which tends to be, usually goes with an idea of limiting attendance by identity, however that identity is defined. And I'm in a place, we just, in the conference, just had this really beautiful conversation across different networks of color, representing all sorts of communities, all sorts of backgrounds, and the intersectionality of our goals and resources that is needed. And I think I was using this term 2 days ago to a friend, where I was like, I'm just looking for my people. And my people includes many, many, many Middle Eastern Muslim queer folks, but also Nataki Garrett, who's a cis black woman, is my people. Eric Ting, who's an Asian American cis straight man, is my people. Mayan Teo, Asian American queer femme human, is my people. So, and I'm always trying to figure out, as I build ensemble or as I build space, especially if the space is either around political action, change making, or it's about difficult conversation or processing, whether that be through laughter or tears, as you said, Andrea. And I'm looking for my people and trying to make sure that the people in the room share some understanding. And I wish as I said, I've just started using this term, so I don't know if I have the articulation of how that is defined for me. But the thing I can say is that I know when someone is and when someone isn't. And that is not necessarily across identity lines for me always. The thing I will say about the digital aspect of the question you asked, social media, the digital space that has really sprung up even more now due to the pandemic and the isolation we all felt through that, has expanded my community, has done great things for my career, has done great things for my organizing and activism and advocacy. And then I attend a conference like this in person and remember that I'm an in-person person. Right? So it's a for me, and as I haven't been back home for so long and my brother lives in a screen as far as I'm concerned, I feel like it's all of it. And it has to be. And if you're an immigrant or children are immigrants, or and it's really telling to me that in this moment of unbearable violence, the thing that Israel is doing is to shut down internet access, right? That is a violent act right now. And if that is the case, we have to accept that digital space and that access is community, is access to truth. And that does not negate the need for me to hug my brother, right, when I see him next. But it is both, and it has to be.
Does anyone else want to comment on this before we wrap up?
Yeah, I'll keep it short just because I know that we're short on time. But I would like it for me, it's always, I'm obsessed with indigeneity. I guess it's because, as we're all indigenous to somewhere. And I invite everybody to invite the folks in their lives, especially white folks or folks that have not questioned yet, where are you from, basically? Where do you come from? We get asked that question a lot, I guess, as otherized, racialized people, as other subjects. And I think that it's time to put that question, back, and it's also like important for each one of us to know where we come from. I believe James Baldwin said that you'll never be able to move forward until you confront your own past, right? And you know where you come from. And to mark your journey, because there's a celebration there of your growth, of how far you've come. So yeah, I mean, just like to ask each other and ourselves, where do we come from, and to return to that place. A beautiful, wonderful writer, and also he's a performance artist, who I love very much. His name is Farda Tabahi. Says that the future is a past that we return to, and I truly believe that. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you all so much for this wonderful space.
Thank you. We're going to end the way that Nabra and I end all of our episodes, our phone calls, the way that you might have ended the 20-minute goodbye at Khaldo or Situ's house, with a nice yalla bye. So can we do it all as a group?
As loud as you can,
It's
so
very
all the
cheesy, but
mics
we
can
love
pick
it.
them up, all right?
Yeah. Okay.
Are you ready? Yalla bye, everyone.
1, 2, 3.
Yalla bye!
Thank you
Thank you so
all
much for joining us. Thank you so much, Feras. Yalla bye!
Feras, don't close Zencaster yet.
I see your hand. We're done with the episode, but we can continue to chat.